recording on this computer. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Weijer, and you can go ahead and get started with the intro whenever you're ready.
Sure. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here and for inviting me. It's great to see you all virtually. And thank you for submitting questions ahead of time. Like I was saying, I thought I'd start off just by talking a little bit about how I got to where I am, not where I am in my background, but where I am as the curator of rare books at the University of Florida. So I started as an undergraduate as a history major. I liked studying history in high school. I was particularly familiar, and I thought I was going to go on to study modern American history because that is what I'd read. But as I started working on my research, I had an advisor who, I'd taken a lot of classes on medieval and early modern Europe. I thought it was a really strange thing that people would write, essentially legendary stories down as real, true things. We all have founding mythologies, but it was a question that I thought was really interesting to study. And one of my advisors had said, well, we have 2 copies of a manuscript chronicle that says that Britain was founded by a guy who was the grandson of Aeneas from Troy, came to Britain, killed a bunch of giants, and named the country after himself. His name was Brutus. And this was the most commonly read history in late medieval England. So she said, we have 2 manuscripts of this in our library. You should go look at them. And as an undergraduate, I should say, I didn't know that rare book curator was a thing that people could do. I didn't know that looking at rare books or manuscripts in a library was a thing that I could do. But I did. And it really got me thinking about the ways that we've thought about materials that we've had, in some cases for centuries, some for much shorter periods of time, as distinct, as special. But they all have a really interesting set of questions about them. So reading a manuscript from the 15th century and then looking at the same history in a printed book got me thinking about, well, not just a manuscript problem, but a problem about reading and thinking across, across time and across how people were trying to convey, information as they have this new thing called the printing press. As I kept studying, I realized that the collections of books that we have and the spaces that we have for them, libraries like this were designed not in the Middle Ages. They were designed in the 17th and 18th century to kind of recapture what people thought they were doing and what they thought a space for the consultation of special books or just indeed important books should look like. And that kind of echo of earlier generations down to the present is really what got me into the idea of looking at collections, looking at libraries, and looking at sort of what people do when they think about the past. I've kind of introduced in the video that I hope you guys were able to see some ways of looking at the materials that we have here in the collections and special collections in all institutions, both in terms of what they say and in terms of how they say it. So older books often have pieces and things added to them that show us how readers or previous successive users were experimenting with the content. We're trying to get something else out of it than maybe their original authors had intended. Modern books do the same thing. And then there's the idea of thinking about, well, what does it mean for different types of information to be put together? So my background is still in the early phase of book production and indeed sort of the study of history and other types of technologies in early modern Europe. And the people who were writing books, the people who were printing them, the people who were kind of emerging as what we'd see as the founders of modern disciplines of science, of technology, of medicine, they weren't thinking of themselves in that way because they weren't reading and they weren't learning in that way. They were learning about the sort of the interconnectedness of everything in a library, possibly their own, possibly their friends. And that's kind of the thing that I think, we've gotten out of the habit of doing when we interact with books, if we interact with books as physical objects. But it's an important way of understanding not just like our own intellectual and cultural history, but the ways that we still look to socialize around information, whether that's in physical form or whether that's sort of digitally. So really being a curator has meant that, I am now in charge of a collection that is about 60,000 books, manuscripts, printed material, the odd wood block and piece of printing technology. But I'm in charge of it, but I'm a specialist in a very, very little piece of it. So I am always learning whenever I open something or whenever I do instruction sessions, whenever I have classes. I'm discovering so much, not just about the collections here, but about what people were doing with books in later periods. And for me, it comes back to them seeing something from an earlier time and trying to replicate it, trying to save it, trying to improve it, using the thought and technology that was available to them. So I did not intend really, as an undergraduate, to be in the place where I am. But by the time I had finished graduate school, I was really looking at libraries, especially, and the books that I studied in ways that were very, very different than I imagined. And it's very much because I was encouraged to look from an early stage. Most people get to advanced research, and that's kind of when somebody says, oh, you should think about, going and working in a collection with primary sources. The books that we have here, and the books in most collections now, are really here for you guys to experiment with. And I think that's an important, it's key to the fact that, it's key to my ability to be here. But it's also the reason that the books are here and that I'm here, I think. So.
It's really interesting. There's been a big theme of interdisciplinarity this semester, with just coincidentally, with all of our speakers kind of working across different disciplines and areas within their work. I kind of want to relate what you were saying. I don't see any hands up yet, but I have my own question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I want to sort of relate to what you're saying with the this discovery scholarship research opportunity that I shared with the group that you're offering, which kind of similarly is based around, I guess, the idea of giving students an early introduction to what it's like to work with these materials and what they can do with them long before, the kind of advanced research stage where that normally happens.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the question that's probably in a lot of students' minds, though, especially in ones that come from like disciplines and departments that don't traditionally, like, okay, probably history and English majors would have the clearest idea of what can be done with these kinds of resources. But are there students with other interests and other subjects, and how do they make use of these kinds of resources, and how does this kind of work fit into other fields,
Mm-hmm.
and what fields could it potentially fit into that we might not be thinking of?
Yeah. Well, I mean, books at their simplest are ways of communicating information, and obviously understanding that information literally is great. That's not the place that I started out from, because reading a medieval manuscript or even reading an early book that's printed in English before English is a standardized language is not something that you just kind of pick up and do. But the ways that books organize themselves, the things that people put into them, their illustrations, their diagrams, their technologies, they're what make them kind of special and unique. They're ways of looking at everything from marketing. We have early examples of printers putting emblems in books, people adopting little signs and symbols and mottos that are often riddles, that are pictures and poems and music. So we can think about those as like the first parts of icons, iconography. The whole area of science, technology, and medicine and natural history is one too, where just looking at an early book, or even a book that was printed before, say, the 20th century, there's a real question of collaboration and interdisciplinarity, and saying, how do you actually make something like this? You have, possibly a researcher taking observations in the field. You have a publisher who's producing the book, but in between, you have a whole army of engravers, illustrators, correctors, collaborators. The process of making these things can take years. And so we're kind of used to seeing books as stable, uniform objects that we can catalog and go back and find. And the role of digital sources, and then sort of like the different aspects of being a curator, or being a researcher in a rare book library. And I think there are a couple of questions still on the sheet. If anybody in the group has more, please pop them into chat. But maybe just to kind of finish, to say, how do you actually go about getting started with these books? And it helps certainly if you have some kind of disciplinary background. Like I said, I was trained as a historian. I knew something about reading histories. I didn't know very much about reading histories that were written in Old English or Middle English, or histories that talked about the successful killing of giants as necessary for the start of the country. But I kind of was able to get in and just spend time really looking and working with the material. Figuring out how things make sense is not the most comfortable practice in the world. Whenever you're doing research in a new field, there's always a part of your brain saying, like, what exactly am I doing? How does this make sense? And as you look at more things, like as you look at it closely, your mind starts to pick out specific aspects of it. For me, it was kind of the way that these manuscripts related to physical books, or the ways that people were trying to convey like timelines in printed form, which are easy to draw, but really, really hard to do in a technology that uses rectangles and straight lines. So those questions then, lead to more. But eventually, when you come back and look at what you've researched, and the Discovery Fellowships are a good example of this. They're kind of like, if you were to explore one object, whether that was an early medical book or an artist book that has all kinds of crazy interactive elements that are still analog, there's no digital component to it, or just you took a class in a particular topic and said, oh, I really liked that class, I'd like to know a little bit more about stuff that was circulating at the time. You can get into that material, you can write a little something, you can create something interesting, you can even produce a digital project or a content, but that'll tell you something not just about the book or the material that you're working with, but you can look back at it and see your own thought process at work. And I don't know if you guys have talked about that in terms of research development, but that's really one of the most interesting things and the most rewarding things about doing this kind of research. You get to look at things that people have seen before, do completely different stuff with them, and then go back and say, why did I gravitate towards that? Why was I interested in this question? Why did I take it in this direction? And you'll learn more about kind of yourself as a researcher, or as a human being, than you knew at the start. So that's kind of, as a first step into that, a fellowship, or even just the ability to come and look at a book, is kind of a nudge in that direction. saying, if you're interested in something, come check it out. That's what we're here for.
Awesome. Yeah, are there any last questions, guys, or do you have any more questions on the sheet that, I mean, we can end here, but if there's anything you didn't get to that you wanted to.
I think that pretty much, between that and the questions that were asked, I think that largely covers what was submitted. I will say, please, recommendations for students that want to write their own books or research papers. Yes, start early. Find people who are interested in working on similar topics. Research is not, even research in a library is not a solitary pursuit. One of the things that the internet does extremely well is you can be in a reading room working with material by yourself. You can take a picture of it and you can send it to people who you know, or in some cases even people that you don't, and say, I see a weird thing, what is this and why is it here? And people can kind of help you along the way. But from the earliest parts of scholarship, that's what research has been about. It's been about finding the people who have different parts of background, different relevant pieces of information, and putting that all together. And a library, for a very, very long time, is the main place where you went to do that. So definitely faculty in your subject area will be good at sort of giving you ideas of topics. But I went to my thesis advisors in undergraduate with a really basic question of, wanting to understand how and why people would believe mythology is history, and vice versa. And she kind of took that based on her own background knowledge and said, here's some ideas that you might want to follow. And that started the project that I still, I'm really interested and engaged with. It's opened up new kind of doors, in not just in books, but in thinking about fakes and forgeries and all kinds of different forms of imposture. And that's kind of, again, what the starting point was, just, coming to a bunch of people, a bunch of specialists with that question and seeing what came back. So thank you. Thank you all for coming and for asking and for watching the videos. And certainly if there's anything, thank you. If there's anything that we can do to help you going forward, or you want to learn more, just please get in touch with me, or check out some of our websites.